I'm with Saleem Anfous from Bethlehem, and we're talking about Nakba Day. Saleem, what is Nakba Day?
So Nakba Day is the word Nakba is a Palestinian word, an Arabic word, which means catastrophe, and it's the day where we remember the catastrophe that happened to the Palestinian people during 1947, 1948, and even 1949. But we called Nakba the 1948 Nakba, which this year we remember 70 years of that time. And basically, what happened is we remember the time where Jewish militias, after the British mandate in 1947, when they declared they're going to leave this area and go back and just let this area be dealt with the UN nation. What happened is Jewish militias started trying to take control and more control of the area, and what they did is through some tactics of invading specific villages in specific areas, like in some parts in Jerusalem and some parts up north, where they did huge massacres in the villages and killing a lot of people there, which also led that not just the village itself, the rest of the people in the village to flee for their safety and for their lives, but also the surrounding other villages to do the same thing and run. And what happened is during those 3 years, 47 till 49, about 500 villages, Palestinian villages, with people that they lived in them, they were destroyed. And so their family, the people who lived there, either between some of them they were killed, and a lot of them they were refugees, turned to become refugees because they were running away for their lives. What happened is part of the catastrophe is about 700 to 750,000 Palestinians. They were refugeed because of those times and because of what they did, and they went to either some other areas in the Palestinian territories, in the Palestinian, which by then, I mean, still it wasn't clear as is Palestinian territories, but in the areas like here in Bethlehem, there are several refugee camps until today. We call them refugee camps because of that. And some Palestinians, they had to go to neighbor countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan.
How many Palestinians became refugees?
So during the time, 750,000 Palestinians became refugee, which today, a lot of those refugees are still refugees, and they are living in, not as in tents, but in areas especially in the neighborhood countries. So basically, like in Lebanon, for example, it's called the refugee camp area, like a Yarmouk camp. What's one of the famous ones, which for the Palestinians who are living there, they're still considered Palestinians. They're not Lebanese citizens. They don't have Lebanese citizenship. They're Palestinians. They don't have actual citizenship because they were refugees since 7 years ago. And like that camp, many others also around the area, the total amount of refugees today, after 70 years, is 11 million.
Do those refugees living outside of the Holy Land, do they have rights like everybody else in that land?
No. Like many of them, they don't. And one main reason is since 70 years, right when they were refugees, when they refuged to those countries accepted them and to help them as refugees, but they don't want them to be integrated as part of them and being citizens of their own countries. Because they, as their country, neighbor countries like in Jordan, for example, they, as a Jordan country, they believe the rights for their Palestinian refugees to return back home to their, and so that's why they don't give them their citizenship to become Jordanians, but yet they still live in the refugee camps until today, not giving them the rights fully as Jordanian citizens, because they also want to make a clear stand that those refugees are not Jordanian citizens, or as the same thing in Lebanon or in Syria and other places, but yet they are still refugees after 70 years and they have the right to return back to their homeland.
Now, did some people fear war was going to take place, so they left their home for somewhere safer for a little period of time, then came back to their house and found out someone else was living there?
Yes. So basically, yes. So a lot of the refugees, most of the refugees, actually, if you go around and just talk to a lot of the refugees or now the families of the refugees, they will actually still be holding the keys for their old houses that they had. Because in their mindset, they thought, well, yeah, there's these Jewish militias that are coming to our villages or coming close to our neighborhoods and they're killing some people. Maybe we'll just move away to our next village or to the next country or to the next city that is close to us to be safe until they leave and we'll come back. And what happened is many, like one of the very famous stories by Ilyas Shakur, Father Ilyas Shakur, in his book, Blood Brothers, where he talks about his life and he remembers it during the Nakba time, where in Bur'am, where he's from. His parents had to leave because the Jewish military and the Jewish militias, they came in and they told him, we want to just live there with you. And then they told him the next day, in the wild, that we would need to, basically what happened is the families had to leave because of the threat that they felt in. And after a while, when they came back, they found out that there was a lot of people who are living in their homes that they were not even their own people. They were European people that came, Jewish European people that came from Europe, and they started immigrating here, and then they started taking other people's homes and living in them. For many, they had to find another place. For some, they fought and they stayed where they believed they had to be. And so today, if we see in the Israeli side, there are still Palestinians who live in Israel, and they have Israeli citizenship, but because they didn't leave during the time of the refugee when majority left.
I imagine when you're running away because you think something's going to happen, you just get a suitcase and you put your belongings in a suitcase and go, and you leave the rest behind. So when people didn't come back, they've lost everything, have they?
Yes, very true. And again, it depends on like where were you from. So if you were during that time, and I'm saying this based on many stories that we heard. So like there's one very, very famous story that is told until today, part of our history. A mother where in their village the militias were coming, and the mother, because she was very frightened, and it was a matter of like minutes, not even hours, that they have to flee for their lives. She wrapped her baby in a blanket, and then she wanted to leave. She took the blanket and left, and after she left, she noticed that she took the wrong blanket, and she left her baby at the house, and she took the wrong blanket. And this is one of the very many stories that we hear. My grandma, she is a refugee. She's from Jaffa. She would still remember when she told us, when she always tells us about her house, how big it was. It was a 3-building floor house where she lived in, and she would still remember until today telling us. And I remember when she was telling us that when the militias came to Jaffa, and there were people in Jaffa, the Palestinians, who had to live free from their lives, especially the families and the kids, she would tell us that when she and many other kids from the neighborhood, they would put them in trucks, and then they put a lot of mattresses and blankets on top of them to try to protect them. And then the men or the women, they will stand on the edges of the truck just to make sure like nothing will harm the kids. And she would say, like, when trucks are driving away from Jaffa, she could see on top of the palm trees and other trees, Jewish militias, or for her during that time, she would say she would see those men on top of those trees with machine guns, and they'll be just randomly shooting at those trucks where they were fleeing away from their home. And that's a memory that my grandma has when she was fleeing, and she was about 11 years old, fleeing her house with her family, and then moving to another place and living until today in another place as a refugee.
So today Israel is celebrating their 70th birthday, but there's really another side to the story as well for the Palestinians, where it was more of a negative time for them.
Yes, it's true. I mean, it is a painful time because 70 years is something that we hear, and like I always say from personal feeling that I felt in the last couple of days during remembrance of the 70 years. One of the thoughts that came to my mind when I started remembering the massacres that happened all around the world, which led to either ethnic cleansing or either like refugees or either, one of the main big stories with Turkey and Armenia. And that was almost 100 and something years ago. Until today, the families and their kids, they remember that. They remember their grandparents. They remember what happened, and they hold it close to their hearts, because that time of history is a painful time of history. That the families and the kids and the new generations, they're teaching the new generations not to forget those times, because those times are times part of history that we have to learn from and know how to move on, but not move on and forgetting it, but also not letting go of what the rights are. As many nations around the world where things like this happen in like massacres and in big numbers and ethnic cleansing and all that kind of stuff, they're taught not to forget. And we have rights as well too. As Palestinians, as for me, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian community, the ethnic cleansing of my people that happened, and that's something that is it's a true fact. And I know I've heard so many people try to say other stories than that. My story is the story of my people. I've heard it from not just my grandma, from people who until today live and they say stories like that because they experienced it from one hand. And there's one Jewish leader that he said in the last 2 weeks, there was this famous quote that he said, well, after 70 years, the elderly are dying and the young will forget. And what he was stating for is basically, as Palestinians, he thinks that he's saying that the elder people, they would forget, like, they're dead, and then our generation and the generation to come, they're going to forget the Nakba and forget what happened to us and our history. And that's something that we're very strongly against, and we're going to strongly stand for, that no, we will never forget this part of our history. And it's a painful time, but with that pain, we still stand. 7 years from that time until today, we still stand strong, demanding our rights, demanding justice for all, and demanding peace for all.
Donald Trump has declared that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Is that a painful time for you as well?
Yes, because in many ways, if we're looking at it, there was an international UN agreement. The countries cannot move their embassies to Jerusalem because Jerusalem still is an occupied area. It's not resolved because of the conflict that's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And by doing so, what that country is declaring is the conflict is over and it's done. And so that's why we're moving our embassy. But sadly, by saying that, you're saying that you're neglecting our rights that we still are asking for. We're still asking for the justice to be in action. We're still asking for justice to be demanded. And so that's why for us as Palestinians, taking an action and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, right where it's actually in saying the embassy in Jerusalem, where yet it's very clear Jerusalem is actually, there's the eastern border and there's the eastern Jerusalem and the western Jerusalem, according to the UN resolution. So basically he's denying that and saying, no, Jerusalem is a capital for Israel, and let's just not, the rights that are for the Palestinians, let's just forget that. Let's not give it that interest. Let's not give it that importance. And for us, that's very painful. It's very painful. I mean, yeah.
Now, you were a Christian here living in Bethlehem. Jesus said, love your enemy. Is that difficult for you to go and love the Jews when you've got so much pain there?
Jesus said it because he knows it's a very difficult thing to do. Jesus clearly said it because he knew one of the most actions that will show a follower of Christ that he is a follower of Christ or she's a follower of Christ is one of the things that they have to do is loving their enemy. Because, that's kind of a big sacrifice for people to do. Imagine if that enemy is not just an enemy that attacked you once or did something bad to you once, but he's an enemy or she's an enemy or they're an enemy that daily basis they're still committing injustice acts toward me and toward my people. And for me as a Palestinian, yes, in one hand, it is very hard. But we are called to love our enemies, and this is what we want to do, and this is what we aim to do. But on the other hand, loving our enemy does not mean to be silent against their injustice. Loving our enemy does not mean that we have to be sitting aside as Christians in the Holy Land, living here, Palestinian Christians, looking at the conflict, what happens between two sides, and say, well, we don't want to get involved because we love everyone. I think this is a misunderstanding of what love is. If we really, as a church and as Palestinian Christians, if we're called to love, we're called to do action. Because love without action is not really love. And the action that we're called to is to ask for justice, pray for all, and just like in the Bible verse where it's my personal favorite in Micha 6:8, where it's very clear in the Bible verse where it says, God wants us to demand justice and mercy and to walk humbly with God. And that's one of my favorite Bible verses because it's very clear what is my message as a Palestinian Christian in here, living in Palestine. That's my message, what to do.
Okay, Saleem, thank you for sharing.
Sure, yeah, anytime.